Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Alistair.
And I'm Nick.
And in today's episode, we'll be doing a long con with Better Call Saul, and then fighting dystopian tech in the future with the third season of Love, Death and Robots. But before all of that, Nick, do you have something to recommend to our listeners?
Yep, this is not the newest thing, but I was on the Marvel Unlimited app because I get a lot of my comics, especially my sort of big two superhero comics, via their apps now. And I was reading Spider-Man Life Story. This is a miniseries that came out possibly like 2019, 2020 now, actually. This is not a super new miniseries, but I finally read it. And yeah, this is a sort of concept miniseries where it's Spider-Man, but he ages in real time. So it was like 6 issues. He starts off as a teenager in the 60s, and then it goes through to 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties and 10s. And obviously by the 10s, in 60 years, he's in like his 70s. So yeah, whereas obviously real, air quotes, Spider-Man in the Marvel comics has sort of aged into this sort of late 20s, early 30s limbo point and then just stayed there. But yeah, this is real-time aging Spider-Man. But it still does most of the storylines from those respective decades in those issues. So like in the 60s, he's obviously in high school. In the 70s, it did the Clone Saga. In the 80s, there was the Venom alien costume stuff. The 90s, more clones. The noughties, Civil War. And then the 2010s, there was the Superior Spider-Man, Dr. Octopus body swap stuff, plus Miles Morales turning up. It was surprisingly poignant, actually. Like, it's written by Chip Zdarsky and drawn by Mark Bagley, who is a classic Spider-Man artist. An interesting choice to pull back for this, because he's mostly known for quite big scale sort of... Well, not big scale exactly, quite classic superhero Spider-Man. So having him do this as an artist who we've known for a long time, again, kind of adds to the poignancy in a weird way. I think you've read some Mark Bagley Spider-Man, actually, Alistair. He drew Ultimate Spider-Man.
Yes, we covered that in the old recommendation section. That was very good, yeah. And again, that was another taking Spider-Man back to his high school roots story, wasn't it?
That, again, had aged him quite slowly. But Mark Bagley himself did 110 issues of Ultimate Spider-Man, and the series by itself as a whole ran for like 200 issues, and the kid never left high school, so still aging quite slowly. Ultimate Spider-Man. Whereas this has this real-life aging gimmick going on. So we get through the marriage to Mary Jane storyline and out into the future. And yeah, it's mostly just surprisingly sad. The twin focuses are, number one, wow, it's clever how he weaves all the major Spider-Man stories into this sort of single ongoing narrative. And number two, wow, Spider-Man sure has a sad life if you actually string it all together and have him have these realistic conversations with his wife about the impacts of their marriage and have him, justify still going out and being Spider-Man when he's like 50.
Oof. yeah. This actually sound a lot grimmer than you'd expect. It's interesting. So the whole thing is kind of like, in a few issues, the entire sort of potted history of Spider-Man.
Yeah, a few issues, each one covering, broadly speaking, about 10 years or so, yeah.
Right, it's an interesting concept. And I suppose, that it does reflect the fact that Spider-Man is quite old as a character, and I guess the world has changed around him. I guess they can update things like the technology in line with him growing, like they get mobile phones and things like that.
Well, yeah, like again, there's some weird time shift stuff going on when you think about the real Marvel Universe, the mainstream Marvel Universe, because obviously if Peter Parker is obviously written in the current comics as living in the 2020s, but that meant he would have been a teenager in like the late noughties, early 10s, if he's currently in his like late 20s.
Yeah.
But of course, if you actually go back and read the comics where he's a teenager, it's the 60s and no one has a smartphone.
Yeah, I guess it's one of those things that like it has to work that way because you want to keep the character close to his essence of being like a teenager and stuff. The Simpsons has got this problem, probably even worse because no one ever ages like at all. In the early Simpsons, there's like episodes about them getting like basic cable packages and like very 90s things, and then when they like bring in like the internet, DVDs, smartphones, it just seems really incongruous because we think the Simpsons is forever trapped in the 90s, but it sort of moves on but sort of doesn't. I guess a lot of long running shows and stories have this issue.
Yeah, the most surprising part about Life Story is honestly how coherent it is, like how Chip Zdarsky, nowadays he's actually quite well known as a writer. He's writing both Batman and Daredevil at the same time, which is an impressive portfolio of grim characters. But he was mostly known as an artist before he did, I think this and a couple of other things were among his first big writing assignments. And he absolutely smashed them, basically. He did incredibly well at this, and I think he did Invaders, and initially took over Daredevil not long after this. And now he's, one of the more well-known writers, as well as still working as an artist. But yeah, this is a great piece of work. Obviously, I appreciate it a fair bit as an existing Spider-Man fan who already knew a lot of the history and could enjoy seeing some of the Easter eggs he's thrown in and seeing how he strings it all together. I can appreciate the fact that there is a substantial story arc for Ben Reilly, the Spider-Man clone, as a 90s Clone Saga fan.
Yeah, you've discussed that on the podcast before. Does it come across as quite rushed? Because obviously it must cannon through a lot in only a few number of issues.
I mean, the issues are slightly longer than an average comic, I think. I think they're giving him like 30 pages instead of 20. But yes, it does come across as quite potted in some ways. I think a lot of the time they do what you kind of have to do and focus in on a couple of key incidents in the decade, or even just one key incident that sort of sums up the decade. You know, a lot happens between issues, so that it's just kind of summarised, or even just kind of elided. You just sort of assume he kept going, and then you just come back when something massive is going to happen. So yeah, unavoidably it's a bit rushed, but the whole life story concept, the whole story of it just being told in this massive sweeping sense, it does come across as, I don't know, deliberate and intentional rather than just, oh god, if only we had 1,000 pages.
Sounds good.
Yeah, and they did a Spider-Man life story annual, by the way, which is also on Unlimited, and is by the same creative team, and is the life story of J. Jonah Jameson running alongside the same Spider-Man continuity.
I imagine that'd be quite good, yeah.
It's good, but also, as is the life story way, quite sad.
Yeah, well, this bitter man just tormented across decades by Spider-Man.
But this sad man who basically hates himself into a miserable life, yeah. Because there's some storylines from the early 60s, 70s Spider-Man where J. Jonah Jameson's hatred for Spider-Man drives him to actually do some morally questionable things, like, you know, sponsoring the creation of supervillains, or having someone build him a big robot so he can remote control it and kill Spider-Man himself, or at least beat Spider-Man up. I suspect they probably stop short of having him try and murder him. So in Life Story, he does those things, and the consequences of those things are played out in a fairly straightforward, depressing, realistic way. So there we go. It's a very good comic if you like Spider-Man, and if you like Mark Bagley art, which, again, as someone who grew up reading Spider-Man in the 90s, 2000s, I do. Anyway, that's me. Alistair, what have you been consuming?
So I've seen a new film that came out yesterday, I believe. So this is quite a contemporary review. And it's a film called Men, directed by Alex Garland, who wrote the novel of The Beach, the screenplay for 28 Days Later, and recently did things such as Ex Machina, Annihilation, and Devs, which we covered on the podcast. This is more of a horror film, as most of those are sort of sci-fi or sci-fi horror. The plot follows a woman called Harper, played by Jess Buckley, whose husband has just died in mysterious and very traumatic circumstances, and then she decides to spend 2 weeks at a sort of a big house in the countryside that she's rented. I think it's a way to kind of process the trauma of this, and she's tormented by the men of the village, all of whom are played by Roy Kinnear, which is a concept the film just kind of embraces and runs with. Everywhere she goes, she's tormented by different versions of the same man, including the sort of posh landowner who owns the house, a local priest, man in the pub, a policeman, various other characters, all played by Roy Kinnear. It's a strange, creepy film. It's kind of got these sort of two broad things going on with it, which is the sort of feminist side of it, which is about how men treat women badly, and which is kind of backed up by all the men being the same man. That sort of plays into that metaphor. And the other thing is this sort of, she's haunted by the figure of the Green Man from folklore, and there's a very sort of lot of religious symbology and sort of folk art and sort of medieval stuff weaved in with the sort of strange soundtrack and stuff. So it's kind of quite creepy and psychological. It's got some really good bits. It's got some really strange bits. I feel it could have pulled together better to form a complete whole, but it's certainly an interesting film that I recommend people seeing.
Yeah, I also saw this with Alistair, so a sort of bonus MFV review here. Yeah, I more or less agree with what Alistair just said. It's annoying because for me it was actually quite close to being genuinely great. If it just, yeah, as you said, pulled its strands together better and given me that moment of massive emotional catharsis I crave, then I feel like this could have been great. Part of me feels like I might be being a simpleton for demanding my cheap emotional catharsis. But yeah, I just never felt like the film quite finished, which is, I guess, as much as I could probably say without spoiling the ending, which in this brief recommendation review I probably shouldn't. But yeah, it is a very, very good, stylish film. I found Devs a bit hard work. I think we did cover that on the podcast. Although it was very nicely made, I found it dragged quite a bit. But this sort of film, a relatively short film as well, which as ever gets a thumbs up from me, does mean his style is kind of contained. And as I say, I came to the end thinking, if only there was a tiny bit more. So be careful what you wish for, etc.
Yeah, well, it's good to be left wanting more. The story is quite a sort of straightforward one, and in those very well executed. And I guess one of my main criticisms of Devs was that it was really well executed, a great style and tone, but the plot was kind of fairly straightforward sort of mystery story that was quite transparent. And this being shorter, like the fact that it's a simple story kind of works in its favour rather than works against it. Dev's being a TV show, you kind of need like a good plot to keep people hanging on for 8 to 10 episodes or however long it is. Whereas like this, the quite simple premise just made it work quite well. And it had a lot of quite scary, tense moments in it, both sort of creepy ones and also that sort of, I guess, the kind of the feminist side of it, the sort of tension of these men don't believe this woman when she says she's been haunted, stalked by someone, and they sort of dismiss her. And there's kind of this sort of almost like institutional walls thrown up everywhere she goes. Yeah, so, and those bits are really quite scary, as well as the sort of more horror-y or folk horror bits. I think, it just lacks something that tied it all up together neatly at the end. But again, other people's mileage may vary on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of it's about the style. Like, as you say, the story is quite simple, which does leave Alex Garland a lot of space in the film to just, do his stylist stuff and have long, pretty shots of the countryside with weird choral music over it, which he does very effectively throughout. So yeah, there's a lot to recommend it just for seeing that on a nice big screen or on your nice big telly whenever this comes to streaming. Because it's definitely a very, very beautiful, well-made film, and a lot of the sort of individual horror stuff is very well done and tense.
Yeah, and the performances are great. Jess Buckley, I think, is excellent in almost everything. She was in The Lost Daughter recently, that was very good. She was in that I'm Thinking of Ending Things. I think she was in The Courier. Like, she's been in a lot of stuff recently and always been very good in that. And Roy Kinnear really pulls off playing all the men. It's a difficult one to give each character their own personality and identity. Yeah, but she does really well at playing this whole range of people. And it's one of those things that it could be quite ludicrous or quite silly, but actually comes across quite well, the fact that almost everyone's played by Roy Kinnear.
Yeah, the first of his men that you see is this sort of massive, over-the-top caricature posho, who, to be honest, comes across as a bit of a Harry Enfield character at times. I did find that's a bit, oh god, is the whole film going to be like this? But happily it is not. He underplays it quite a lot with most of the other men.
Yeah, but no, I think they both deserve plaudits for doing excellent performances. Yeah, the film overall I thought was entertaining, and I don't know, Alex Garland's he really puts like style and sort of flair on his films. I mean, there's a lot of people on film Twitter who kind of complain that certainly blockbuster cinema is kind of becoming a bit sort of flat and tonally quite similar. We've talked about this on the podcast, and I think Alex Garland deserves some applause for actually having, I don't know, a real sense of style and tone, and really trying to make his films visually and musically interesting. So it's, if you're concerned things are too similar, this is something that's definitely different.
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to end up in the best films of the year list. We'll have to see how the year goes, but it may well be among the more interesting ones. And first up today, it's Better Call Saul Series 6A, or the first half of Series 6, which is of course the final series of the Breaking Bad prequel, and in this particular run we're mostly continuing with the fallout of the events of the end of Season 5, in which criminal lawyer Saul Goodman, aka Jimmy McGill, and his wife Kim, played by Bob Odenkirk and Ray Seahorn, decided to launch an aggressive campaign against their lawyer rival Howard Hamlin, played by Patrick Fabian, to, discredit him and ruin his life, just that sort of thing. And meanwhile, Nacho Varga, played by Michael Mando, our other tragic protagonist, had been pressured into launching an assassination attempt against big villain Lalo Salamanca, played by Tony Dalton, by massive, quiet, evil drugs kingpin Gus Fring, played by Giancarlo Esposito, and unfortunately he has not succeeded. And the ramifications of that will form the other half of this season's plotline. Well, this half season, I guess. Anyway, so yes, this is the last season, as I say, so things should very much be rising to a conclusion. It really should be getting exciting now. Alistair, is it?
Yes, I would say in a nutshell, they do accelerate the pace in this final few episodes, and they are definitely wrapping up, characters and plot lines. So yeah, they're paying off a lot of the stuff they set off and answering some of the big questions raised by the show. We've talked a lot, I think, every time when we discussed Better Call Saul about the best way to create tension in a prequel, and what's done it well and what's not done it well. And it usually boils down to basically introducing characters that, you don't know what happens to them based on having watched the thing that this is a prequel to. So characters that don't appear in Breaking Bad, so you're not sure what is going on with them. So yeah, there's a list of characters, and you think so what's going to happen to them? And they have spent a lot of the season wrapping up those plot lines, which means you're paying off the big questions. I'm dancing around spoiling what happens to people and how these are wrapped up.
Yeah, we'll drop a spoiler wall in a bit, I think, and talk about the actual ending, because I kind of want to.
Or even the mid-season episodes, or because this is the first half we're talking about. So the midpoint of the first half drops some big revelations as well. We're certainly heading towards a conclusion, not quite as fast as I thought we would be, but still, they're definitely really paying things off at this point.
Yeah, I think at this point we're definitely going to be staying in this sort of prequel timeline until more or less the end of the show. We might maybe get 1, 2, maybe 3 episodes that jump into the future a bit at the end, but I reckon we're here for quite a while.
Yeah. I had predicted incorrectly that the first half of the final season will take us up to the beginning of Breaking Bad, and then the second half, which starts in a few weeks, would then be wrapping up any storylines post Breaking Bad. And I guess it's not too much of a spoiler to say at this point that, there's definitely unresolved prequel storyline at the end of this half season.
Yeah, as I say, I'll be surprised if we get to the post-Breaking Bad timeline much before the last couple of episodes at this point. I think they've definitely got a lot more to do.
Yeah.
It's interesting because in some ways this was still quite a slow burn, like especially sort of around the sort of mid to latter midpoint of the season, the half season, whatever. Episodes like 4, 5 and 6 out of the 7, which is, nearly half of it, is still quite a sort of slow, creeping, tense build-up to what happens in episode 7. It's not, it's not rushing like a rocket ship or anything.
No, it's definitely much slower paced than Breaking Bad, and is a real slow burn, slow build, which is what I do really like about it. That this is it's a very slow paced kind of character show. The drama's really rooting the characters and revealing them, and at this point, sort of 6 seasons in, you've got a very detailed understanding of these characters and how they've changed, and you really do understand what motivates them and what drives them. And they're really kind of exploiting that at this point, but still adding layers and doing sort of rich character development as well as wrapping up the plot lines. So I'm glad it's kind of remaining itself, this much quieter character-focused drama right until the end.
Well, yeah, we've talked before about Better Call Saul's fascination with process and sort of exactly how things are done, and try to make, these long plans being executed by these clever people in this quite involved way still interesting and good television, which it completely succeeds at somehow. I mean, if anything, they've leaned more into that as the show has gone on, especially in the sort of pre-credits cold open bits. They do love a lovingly shot process montage in there, and then usually another one later as well.
Yeah, you get at least usually 2 an episode. They always create suspense, because basically this very detailed process has been enacted, and it makes you sit there and wonder what is this process? I just want to know how does this pay off? How does this relate to the main storyline? And I think at this point you're either sold on this aspect of the show or not. I can imagine a lot of people felt like this show is quite slow paced and needlessly obtuse at some points, or needlessly obfuscating what's going on to create drama, or you're just I just love the fact this is slow and you see things in a lot of detail, and then at some point it clicks into place, oh, that long sequence of someone I don't know,
embedding a ruler in plastic. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, will suddenly that's a really good example. Will suddenly pay off in just maybe one shot or one scene right at the end of an episode, and you're saying oh, that now I totally get it now. I do really like that aspect of the show, and that's why I'm really on board with. And then if you're still with the show at this point, then yeah, you probably are as well.
Yeah, and this half season featured what might be their most sort of ambitious, very slow process reveal. The way it sort of focuses on the tiny bits of this larger plan that Jimmy and Kim are putting together over the course of the first 6 episodes. It's very much showing you the wheels within the wheels without pulling out to show you the whole, or feeling different bits of the elephant, or whatever metaphor you want to use. Because they've got this one big con they're pulling on Howard Hamlin, and throughout the first 6 episodes of the show, they show you tiny little bits of it that they're putting together, little elements, and they don't let you see the whole until the very, very end. And again, as they said, that's the sort of thing that could become impatient, or could make you impatient. But yeah, if you've been with the show this long, then they're, I guess, rewarding you with this most elaborate reveal yet.
Yeah, a lesser show could have executed the entire long con in one episode. I mean, it's not more complicated than the average episode of Hustle. They could have done it in a fast length of time, and it's a sort of a slow process of it being revealed over several episodes, and you kind of get bits and pieces, and you kind of slowly comes together, and then only right at the end do you reveal what they kind of the long complicated plan they've been building up to. Yeah, so it is almost one big process montage for half a season. And then the other flip side, which is also a similar sort of thing, which is Lalo, having survived his assassination attempt, sort of unpicking Gus's mechanism that tried to assassinate him. So it's him, again, slowly uncovering the mechanism of Gus's, operation, and trying to, find a weakness in it so that he can exploit it and get revenge on Gus. So again, there's a sort of process of a con being put together and a process of a crime thing sort of being taken apart slowly over several episodes. But then it is very, very tense. I think partly because, several plot lines relate to cartels and drug smuggling, which is obviously incredibly dangerous. So there is always that layer of violence lurking in the background, which does add a lot of tension to it, including the fact that obviously Lalo survived an assassination attempt at the end of the last season. So the stakes are high. Sort of bloody violence is a thing that could erupt at any moment, which does add to the tension as well.
Well, yeah, and there's a lot of credit for Tony Dalton's performance as Lalo here. He's only introduced a couple of seasons ago. He's one of the comparatively recent major characters. And yeah, again, I guess due to the sheer menace he exudes, along with this sort of weird charm, but at this point, just keeping him off screen and making sure we all know he's, very angry and likely coming for revenge. You can basically just have the rest of the characters living in fear of it, and it works. Because a lot of the crime half of the show, this half season, again, especially in that sort of episode 4 to 6 stretch I mentioned, is basically all the crime characters living in fear of the vengeance of Lalo.
Yeah.
And again, because Tony Dalton's done such a good job of making him fucking terrifying, it does actually work.
Yeah, but he comes across as like a human being. He's got that sort of, it's like easy charm to him, but also like the masks this like incredibly like violent undertone.
Which is quite an archetypal character, but it is a very, very good version of it.
Yeah, and I think it's the performance that makes it, certainly. The tension goes up whenever he enters the room, especially whenever Lalo or another character from the crime side enters Saul's sort of legal drama side. The tension instantly goes up because, again, this is the point when Saul's two worlds are bleeding into each other. His, largely respectable legal practice in that he, stays within the law and he does help criminals who are in legal problems, but is sort of providing a service to the justice system. And he is conning Howard, but again, he's not like trying to steal all Howard's money. He just wants Howard to settle a big case so Saul gets his share of it. There's even a point when he says to Howard, you'll land on your feet, you'll be okay. Howard's a huge, successful lawyer. You can have a bit of egg on his face. It seems like a lower stakes drama, the Saul side, but he has got the problem that these two worlds are bleeding together and his frisson with the cartel is coming back to haunt him, which is again, something they've been building to a while, the point when Saul's kind of nice, although slightly morally dubious life is about to come into hurtling collision with the very dark and violent world of the cartels.
Yeah, and I think when we were covering this show around seasons 3 and 4, I had been heard to moan that the lawyer stuff was a bit more interesting to me than the crime stuff. The crime stuff was sometimes verging a bit into what I will dismissively call prequel shit. There was a whole season where the storyline was basically, how did Gus dig that big hole?
Yeah.
It was actually enough for me just to know there was a big hole, guys. This is one occasion where your fascination with process is not coming over to me.
Yeah, that did feel a bit like a needless explanation of how the thing came to be. It's obviously a major piece of the Breaking Bad plotline, how they built that big underground meth lab, but the fact that they just did it is all the explanation I needed, as you say, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, elements of that are now coming back in the finale, and based on some things we saw in the very, very last episode, I suspect more elements of that may come back later, so... Yeah. Who knows? It's interesting because, as you say, there's a lot of the remaining plots. I guess I could still just about do this without spoilers. Centers around the threat Lalo poses to the crime guys, but a lot of the characters on the crime side are Breaking Bad characters. He's not going to kill Gus, is he? Unless we're going to suddenly join the multiverse trend here in Better Call Saul. I have a lot of faith in the writers of this show at this point. For the last couple of seasons especially, they've been absolutely on it. Season 5 and 6 so far of Better Call Saul have been fucking great. So I have a lot of faith that they will find a way to make this good, but I am interested to see how they do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that does lack tension, like you say. That he can't kill Gus, he can't kill Mike, he can't kill Saul. But there is still tension in it, and I guess they need to find out what does happen. And the tension that has comes from basically, I think, the two big unanswered questions left, which are... Well, do we drop the spoiler wall at this point?
Okay, I think we've danced enough, yeah. If you haven't established that already, we liked this. It's good. Watch all 6 seasons. And now we're going to drop a spoiler warning and talk in moderate detail about the big deaths and so on in this season.
Yeah. So, from the beginning, one of the big questions is, what happens to Nacho? And, he dies in about halfway through.
That's what's going on.
He takes his own life, I think, as a way to sort of keep his father out of the clutches of the cartel, which is one of his primary motivations. Then there's, I guess, one of the questions, what happened to Howard? Again, Saul's brother, which he had a difficult relation with. Howard is obviously a close friend to Saul's brother, but also he did support Saul and was, actually quite nice to him. Howard's not a two-dimensional nasty guy who's a successful lawyer. He's, you kind of get to know him and like him and realize he's a multifaceted character. There's a process montage that very subtly reveals the sort of quiet misery of his home life, which is quite sad. And then, obviously Howard gets humiliated by Saul and then killed by Lalo. So that's the end of him.
Yeah, I mean, that was quite a major element in this half season as well. Humanising Howard a little bit, which turned out to be so we'd feel sad, as you say, when Lalo just summarily executes him just because he's in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And also when Saul and Kim play this sort of con on him and humiliate him in front of his colleagues and things like that. I mean, we couldn't really explain the con because it's quite complicated, but it's executed in a sort of very subtle and believable way. And you do almost feel bad for Howard because he gets humiliated and you feel he doesn't deserve this. Obviously, you're kind of rooting for Saul to successfully humiliate Howard, force him to settle this big case. Saul gets the payout. That's kind of what you're rooting for because you're on board with the main character. But at the same time, you feel Howard's not a nasty person who deserves something terrible happening to him. But he does. And then, unfortunately, again, so much of everything that happens is really, really rooted in the characters and characters they've built up in a big way. And Howard just can't let it go. So he has to confront Saul about it, and even though Saul's basically denying everything, and then Lalo shows up, and because when the two plot lines merge, and just executes Howard apropos of nothing. And it's really show that if Howard could only just let it go, move on, then he would still be alive. If Saul hadn't dragged cartels into their quiet existence, he'd still be alive. It's all kind of looping back to the characters and what motivates them, and they kind of got to this point, which I think is quite poignant, with basically Saul kind of corrupts everything he touches. Everything he does, kind of nasty things get involved with. There's something almost mythic about how everything he builds ends in people getting hurt and destroyed, like his brother dying before, and now Howard being killed. But it's only because he just can't help himself from basically wreaking havoc and destruction.
Yeah, and that's also coming across in the sort of undertone of this con storyline they're putting on Howard, in that Kim is very much the driving force of this con. It was her idea, basically, and she's the one who's yes, no, we have to do this. This is the right thing to do. And although it's underplayed and it's subtle, and they never have a confrontation about it, although I suspect they might in coming episodes, but they haven't yet. But it's always subtly clear that Kim is a bit more into this than Saul is, but he kind of feels like he has to, partly because he doesn't actually like Howard either, even though he's aware that this is maybe a bit harsh, and partly because he loves Kim.
Yeah, and he got her introducing in the whole world of conning back in when they were sort of in the early stages of dating, right back in the first season, when they pull some low-level cons, such as they con a investment manager out of a dinner and some expensive drinks. Not really the worst thing ever, They convince the man to invest in their fictional business and write a check, which obviously they never cash because the business is fictional and they can't. It's more just doing it for the sense of doing it. He's got Kim hooked on the rush of basically the con, and now she's fully into it even more than he is. And it's genuinely the fact that but it's because of him. He's corrupted everything to the point when Kim turns down an interview for her dream job, which is working for a foundation, helping poor people stay out of prison. But she does that in order to con Howard. So even though she's been worse than Saul, he's the kind of patient zero for moral degradation in this show.
Yeah, and there's still a step to come somewhere for Saul to become the seemingly completely amoral character he is in Breaking Bad, and it'll be interesting to see what that final step is. I mean, obviously, one has to assume it involves Kim leaving in some way, leaving or dying. Yeah, there were basically 4 major, prequel characters in this show, characters who have to be, filed away before Breaking Bad starts, and, 2 of them were Nacho and Howard, and they're now dead, which just leaves Lalo and Kim.
Yeah.
And to be fair, before I go on to Lalo and Kim, a word for Nacho, who did an amazing performance in his death episode. I mean, Michael Mando's always been good, and he's good in all the 3 episodes of this half season he's in, but his final episode, which is mostly about him and his sort of tragic walk to sacrifice, is an amazing performance. It's really, really, really sad. It's the sort of thing that in this show often leads to a sort of last-minute rescue or last-minute save. There's a lot of lingering shots of Mike watching this sort of horrible exchange between Nacho and the cartel from a distance with a sniper rifle, and you sort of, I think, are meant to expect that Mike's gonna have a fatherly change of heart and kill the cartel members to save Nacho or something. But no, that does not happen. the sad tragic thing happens, and Nacho ends up just killing himself to avoid being tortured.
Yeah, it is a great performance, from Michael Mando, as you say. And we talked a lot about how well written this show is, and actually, I think we should say like how brilliantly cast it is and how great everyone is. Like they really found good people. Obviously, Bob Odenkirk is a long-standing, very successful comedy actor, mainly actually now doing dramatic stuff. Everyone in it is really ace at their roles. I think, Michael Mando, he's a lot of stuff, and he's very good, usually playing a lot of villains and things, but he's always a really good actor, and it always does a great performance. And even people like the guy playing Howard, I think, really embodies this sort of small town bigwig lawyer incredibly well. Ray Sheehorn as Kim again adds layers and layers to the character. Interesting, one of the flashback process montages in this episode also has Ray Sheehorn playing the Kim character's mum in a flashback.
Oh, I looked into that. That's not actually her.
Is it not? Oh my god. I really thought it was.
No, it's just a very well cast mum actor. But no, that's not Ray Sheehorn.
I thought they did a very... right. I thought they did a clever thing there. Okay, well, I take that back. Should have researched that point before I just dropped it on the podcast. Yeah, I think everyone is very well cast in this. Yeah, unless we said like Lalo as well. I think as well as the writing is the thing that's really the star of this show, and that's why as a writer I really enjoy it. But I think the casting is spot on and all the characters play their parts so well.
Yes. So anyway, back to listing deaths. So really it's just Lalo and Kim left at this point.
Yeah.
I feel like Lalo's going to die. I suspect he might maybe take someone else down with him, but he feels like he's the sort of character who dies. Probably messily.
It's probably the closest thing the show has like to a villain. He's certainly an antagonist to all the characters that we most care about. So I guess, he is very much the villain of the piece. So I think he's going to end up with some kind of unpleasant end.
Yes, and it'll be interesting to see it. And I guess, because, as we said earlier, Tony Dalton's been very good. Hopefully they'll, make a big deal out of that. And that'll, I guess, be the big cathartic moments of the finale to the extent that there is one. Because obviously this show is kind of a tragedy. So it's not going to end well for our heroes. But one of the few victories they may have is that they'll presumably take down Lalo at some point, or someone will.
Yes.
Michael gets to kill him, maybe, who knows.
But knowing this show, it will create more complications that have to be ramified. That's the thing. Nothing's ever neat. And it's like real life in that sense. Like you can't kill someone and then not be complications from it down the line.
Yeah, and if we're going to play predictions, and I stress I have no knowledge, I haven't Googled for spoilers or anything. I'm just throwing things out there based on all the creative writing books I've read. I sort of feel like Kim might go away and come back in the future timeline. That seems like something that might happen because I think they'll want the future stuff to seem of a piece with the past flashback stuff they've been doing. So my gut feeling is Kim goes away and comes back. Possibly prison, possibly going into hiding like Saul is. I don't know. Not necessarily they reunite. It's very possible that the last scene of the show will be future Saul watching Kim sadly from afar as she gets on with her life. My gut feeling is that the show somehow ends with Kim coming into the future timeline.
Yes, I would bet on that. They need to make it relevant somehow, these black and white flash forwards they've done to Saul's post-Breaking Bad life, working in Cinnabon and being an incredibly law-abiding, head-under-the-radar sort of citizen. Yeah, they need to kind of make that relevant at some point, and bringing Kim into it in some way is the easiest way to do that. But I guess it remains to be seen what shape or form that takes. That's one of the mysteries that have been set out that they're still to address. Yeah,
and obviously I believe it has been confirmed in some release news photo press thing that Walter White and Jesse Pinkman will appear in some form on screen, although how extensively remains to be seen.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll be back, I'm sure, in however many months. I think sometime in August is where the show will finally finish.
There's 6 episodes left, I think, and there's like a break. I think we might be covering this as episode 170.
There you go, lads. Mark it in your calendar. But yeah, if you needed anyone else to tell you to watch this show, it's good. Well, watch Breaking Bad and then watch this.
I mean, you could do, what I did, which is that I didn't start watching Breaking Bad until the gap in between the first and last bits of the final season. There was a year between them rather than a few weeks.
I was going to say, if you're going to cram them, you've got all of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. You've got about a month, or maybe 2 months if you count the time it takes them to air the second half.
I don't think you have to watch Breaking Bad to enjoy this, but this is, if you want to be up to date with Better Call Saul, then this is your last warning to get cramming, to enjoy the final bits as they happen. This is your final warning.
I would vaguely be interested to hear the perspective of someone who has not seen Breaking Bad and watches this, because I suspect the show is good enough that you could enjoy it anyway, but it's strange. I think a lot of it is relying on foreknowledge. But anyway, yes, I'm not one of those people, so who knows. Okay, and last up today, it's the third volume of Netflix's Love, Death and Robots. This is, of course, their anthology of short sci-fi stories. Well, in practice, kind of sci-fi, fantasy, horror short stories. Mostly, but not always, with a slightly grim predilection. The only real linking factor being that they're all animated in varying different styles. We have watched all 3 of these volumes over the course of our podcast, and as is traditional, we will be talking a bit about it, and then we'll be giving you our top 3 episodes. But before we get into the exciting chart material, what did you think of this volume, Alistair?
Overall, it was very strong. Again, an observation we trot out every time we talk about Love, Death and Robots is that, the nature of an anthology show is it can be hit and miss. That applies to, Black Mirror, Inside Number 9, this. But again, overall, more hit than miss. There wasn't one that I thought was terrible or thought that was a complete waste of time. The worst ones were just a bit kind of bland, and considering each one has its own identity and its own story, and there's not one that really kind of just completely fell on its arse, so they're getting better at this. They're all kind of quite dark, dystopian. There's a lot of gory ones this time, and seems to be less funny ones, but I don't know, I quite like that. I quite like the dark and gory ones.
Yeah, no, I think this is probably based on my vague memories of the first 2, which I obviously haven't rewatched or anything. Possibly their best volume in terms of quality control. This did have the least ones, which I felt were a bit dull or fillery. And also, much less try-hard edgy shit, which I appreciated. I do remember coming away from certainly the first collection of Love, Death and Robots thinking, wow, sure was a lot of excessive swearing and lingering on the sexy ladies in that, wasn't there? But this one, no, this did feel a bit more measured.
Yeah, the first one had a lot of sort of explicit sex scenes and quite violent scenes. But there were lots of violent scenes in that, but the first one had sexual violence in it, which I felt was, again, sort of needlessly edgy. There are some very violent ones in this, but they either came across as sort of more of a sort of body horror type violence, or again a sort of boys-esque violent comedy, in that this is sort of disturbing and violent but kind of funny at the same time.
Yeah, the one that was sort of a weird parody of G.I. Joe. What was it? Kill Team Kill.
Yeah, when they fight an enormous cybernetronic grizzly bear that's basically armed to the teeth. Which is kind of funny, but also actually is quite scary, because bears are fucking scary because they're huge and strong, and this one's got weapons and armor and stuff.
Yeah, no, that one was, spoilers I guess for my upcoming chart, but yeah, I really enjoyed that one. That was just so silly. It both works as a general parody of G.I. Joe and almost as a gentle parody of themselves. I appreciated that one a lot.
Yeah, a lot of strong ones here, and a real range of tones and style, which is quite good. You don't feel like they're doing the same thing over and over, which is again possibly my criticism of Black Mirror, which is they are tonally quite similar. They all end on the same sort of dark, depressing note, whereas some of these end on dark, depressing notes, sometimes optimistic, sometimes funny, sometimes just a kind of,
Yeah, I think there's an enjoyable sort of range of animation styles, which I think mixes it up a bit. As ever, when I watch one of these, there's always at least a couple of episodes where the animation is so amazing, I come away thinking, wow, technology, eh? And a lot of it is just sort of what I'd call quite standard. Although I must admit, we are getting further and further away from the uncanny valley. There's some of the sort of realistic animation used in this is impressively realistic, to the extent that I'm a little bit, was that actually animation?
Some of the most realistic ones. There are a couple when they just went for full photorealism, no style. I think they were done with motion capture technology. I guess, the way that Gollum was done in Lord of the Rings and various other things. It's I think the way how the digital de-aging works for, things like The Irishman. So, yeah, I guess there is a human performance that's been mapped into the computer there. But I guess they're all animated. There are no live action Love, Death and Robots.
There's a couple where I was very much, wow, at some point we've crossed the Rubicon here. I can barely tell the difference between that and real people.
Yeah, there were definitely some when I was this really does look incredibly realistic. Is it actually a live action one? Yeah.
I must admit, as we'll discover when we get into my charts, those aren't necessarily my favourite. There's an extent to which this may make me sound like a sad old man, but when I watch animation, I quite enjoy the more stylized stuff. I quite enjoy animation that's obviously animation. I don't know, some of the ones that are really, really focusing on the realism, yeah, I don't know, it almost pulls me out of it a bit, because I feel like the main thing I can think of it when I'm watching it is, again, wow, technology, eh?
Yeah, I like the more stylized ones, the ones where the animation is expressing something about the world or the story. The sort of style and sort of visual approach is contributing to the tone and the feel and the story, rather than just trying to convince you that this is a live action thing that actually happened. Although, yeah, none of them were bad. When we get to the chart, if I want to pre-up the chart, I don't think there are any in my top 3 that were of the sort of photorealistic ones. But
there's one of mine which might count, we'll see. Yeah, the only one that I came away a bit cold from. So I guess if we're doing a worst, this is my worst. Although it's not actively bad, to be fair. It's just, it was actually quite a strong collection, and this was, in my opinion, the least strong, was Swarm, which was fine, I guess. I was enjoying bits of it, but the ending especially was a bit...
Yeah, so Swarm was an interesting one. It narrowly missed out on being on my top 3. If I was at the top 4, I might have included it. The story isn't particularly original. I kind of felt that like there were 3 types of sort of stories that they did. The ones that were kind of quite funny, the ones that were trippy, hallucinogenic, and the ones that were basically like a sort of sci-fi short story that you could have found in any sort of anthology of sci-fi short fiction. And Swarm was very much like, this is a classic sci-fi short story. There's some scientists, they're investigating a big alien colony thing in space. They attempt to exploit it. It backfires, and there's lots of alien bugs involved. The story, not winning any prizes for originality. It's, very much like a sort of sci-fi anthology short story type thing, which is why it didn't make into my top 3. I just thought the animation for that was beautiful, very, very realistic. The character design on all the different bugs, I just thought looked really, really just amazing. The way they kind of brought the whole swarm to life, and the kind of all these different alien bugs, and the way they looked and had their like kind of roles and identity. Like a lot of thought had gone into the character design in the CG, especially of the non-human characters, which I did really like. But it was let down by basically like, this is a fairly boilerplate sci-fi story.
Oh yeah, and I mean the other one, what was it? Invaulted Halls Entombed. I don't know, it wasn't doing quite the same thing, but the ending especially went to quite a similar place, and I ended up coming away thinking, well, that was better.
Yeah, that one was, was that the second last one?
It was the second last one with the vaguely Lovecraftian overtones. Not in my top 3, but I thought it was better than Swarm.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't dislike any of them. That one had some good body horror stuff in it. Again, it's so to me that like this is, a sci-fi short story from any anthology of sci-fi short stories. A bit of Lovecraft, a bit of army dudes with tech fighting things. What's not to like? I like Lovecraft, despite his horrific racism. But yeah, I guess it wasn't really like setting my world on fire.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of them which have some things to like about them, but don't quite put it together. Like, I quite enjoyed the very pulse of the machine, but in a similar way to the movie Men, actually. I never felt that the wankiness quite got me to that point of story, character, catharsis, or whatever. I never felt like it quite hit me hard enough.
Yeah. It's interesting, yeah.
That's your number 1, isn't it? Don't tell me yet. We'll get there.
I mean, for the last time we did this, we all chose different... I think we chose basically different stories. Like, there was very little crossover, so let's see.
Sounds like we'll be doing that again. But, okay, shall we begin?
Yeah, well, I've chosen top 3, and then I've got the honourable mention.
I too have an honourable mention, so... Okay, honourable mention, Night of the Mini Dead. The mini zombies one. I enjoyed this enormously. I couldn't quite bring myself to knock something out of a top 3 for it because it's quite simple, but the concept of this sort of miniature zombie thing, the weird cuteness of it, the funny little Pingu voices, I just laughed all the way through. A great time. I couldn't quite bring myself to rank it above any of the actual stories because it was just so silly and a bit more of a sort of weird comedy online clip than a story, but still, fuck yeah.
Yep, this is also my honourable mention for the exact same reason that I really liked it but didn't feel that it belonged in the top 3 because it's just kind of more of a skit. It's like 6 minutes long. It's not even just kind of shorter than a short film. But yeah, it's like done with like, I think they're like models, like Micro Machine type models, and it's all shot from like extreme long distance, like you're standing on a hill looking down at the events. And it starts with some teenagers fucking in a graveyard and inadvertently releasing zombies. Then you just get long shots of cities being overrun with zombies, and then the zombies being mutated when they attack a nuclear power plant or something like that, and becoming like mega giant killer flame breathing zombies. The whole thing was just incredibly silly. Yeah, there was no actual dialogue that kind of was intelligible. Yeah, like I say, sort of Pingu voices. But yeah, it was great. I think it's not really enough of a story to be in the top 3 stories, but it's got an honourable mention for having a concept and just doing it.
Yeah, and for having a sort of unique style animation thing going on as well.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yes, it's not in the top 3, but honestly, if you watch only one of these, maybe watch this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so your third favourite of Love, Death and Robots Season 3.
Okay, already mentioned, but here it comes again. Number 3, Kill Team Kill. I just respect the weird vibe of mock adult Saturday morning cartoon it's doing here. Like, it's got this sort of 90s extreme, knowing ludicrousness. I mean, to be honest, I sometimes get a bit tired of military sci-fi in these stories. It feels almost like too easy an approach to just go, there are some soldiers, there's a thing, go. But played to just ludicrous extremes like this, I just laughed all the way through. It's not big or clever, but I just enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, I like this one a lot. It did not make the top 3, but it was very good, and it kind of reminded me of The Boys in that I guess it's some army dudes and some very violent stuff. This was a bit more stylized, but it was incredibly violent, I think. Either was more cartoony.
Yeah, I liked the sort of the weird, over-the-top lad-soldier banter throughout. It's just very, very stupid.
Yeah. And the bear, the cyber electronically enhanced bear, is actually like really scary because, again, I think I said before, bears are actually quite scary because they're like all muscle and they're massive. And bear enhanced with military hardware is even scarier.
Yeah, no, it's good bear.
Good bear content. Sorry.
No,
that doesn't make sense, does it? Right. So is it time for me to mention my third favourite?
Yeah.
So this one was Mason's Rat, the one in which a Scottish farmer, discovers that the rats have organised and developed weapons and little crossbows in his barn. So he hires or buys this giant cybernetic scorpion killing machine to fight the rats. And then the rats continue to organise and fight it.
Yes, this is my number 2, so this is very much what we were about to go on to. Yes, I love this one. I liked the sort of weird semi-Pixar, semi-Wallace and Gromit vibe this had. The animation on this was great. Again, it's sort of, I guess it's kind of a similar joke to Kill Team Kill in that it's quite sort of vaguely kids' film animation, but it's ridiculously cartoonishly violent. Yeah,
this one's a bit more realistic than that, but it's very, very violent, with the rats being like killed by this killing machine and stuff, and it is just very, very funny. The whole thing, it's just ludicrous premise taken to ludicrous lengths, which I thought was really good. But I felt that it had a really sort of simple, effective story. Like, it's only like 12 minutes long. These kind of vary between like about 5 minutes to about 25 minutes. But this one's not particularly long. But it kind of hits all the main story beats like really well. Like, it's like a tight 3-act structure. He discovers the rats. He gets the killing machine, and then there's a resolution, which maybe we won't spoil. There's like escalation throughout, rising sense of tension. There's a try-fail cycle, as he tries to exterminate the rats and always fails. There's a moment when the character has to make a tough decision to resolve the conflict. It's a real masterclass in like really just tight storytelling.
Yes, no, this was a great time. I enjoyed this one a lot. I say this is my second best. So yeah, I was very much going for the silly, violent children stuff.
Yeah.
So what's your number 2?
My second favourite is Jibaro, which was the last one. And this one's got a real style to it. And it was like really, I don't know, there's something really like lurid about it. And like kind of, it's a sort of very trippy story about some conquistadors who stumble across a sort of water spirit that lures them all to their death. And the one knight called Jibaro who survives because he's deaf and can't hear the siren call. It's just a very strange, creepy story. It's got absolutely no dialogue in it, which I quite liked. Brilliant sound design.
Yeah, once again, we're rolling here because this was my number 1. Yeah. Sound the honks. I love this. I think mostly it was the sort of weird semi-handheld camera animation vibe and the, as you say, the weird silence of it. It just cast a spell in a weird way. And this sort of strong, visceral, like mythological fable type story. Very good. Very, very good.
Yeah, I did the handheld camera sort of thing, the animation. I think it did that thing that like 28 Days Later does when they drop frames from the video, so things kind of look in a sort of slightly jerky but sort of, I don't know if I'm going to say, like very sort of sudden movements. Yeah, again, it really creates a heightened sense of tension. But just the sound design was just amazing, like all the clanging of the metal of the soldiers of their armour as they rode the horses. The deity or water spirit is kind of covered in gold, and the sort of clinking gold sound she makes. The way they convey his deafness through his point of view bits and the sound changes. I just thought everything's firing on all cylinders. Like, it's great animation design and direction, but like great sound and music.
Yeah, no, I found this, despite being reasonably long and entirely silent, weirdly entrancing. You described it as lurid a second ago. That's a good word. Sort of the weird colours of it. Yeah,
it's almost like a fever dream. Again, it's a sort of strange thing that these people wandered into the forest and stumbled across this water spirit that wants to lure them to their deaths.
Yeah, and as I say, it did the sort of folk horror, again, not unlike the movie Men, quite well.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was my number 1. That was the best one in my opinion. Alistair, what's your number 1, and is it The Very Pulse of the Machine?
Yes, it was, yes. I know, I liked it. It's a good sci-fi story. Again, it's really trippy, surreal, like got the sort of strongest animation style coming through. But a really strong emotional story about these two people stranded after a spaceship crash, and one's trying to pull the other one to safety. Again, simple story. There's a Ian M. Banks short story that's almost exactly the same that I quite liked, if they were riffing off that, or maybe it's just a massive coincidence.
I mean, some of them are adapted from short stories, but I didn't catch the credits for this one.
That only has one character in it, so it's probably not a direct adaptation, and it's got a different title. I don't know, it certainly felt inspired by Ian M. Banks. Again, especially the kind of druggy trippiness of it all.
Yeah, again, as I said earlier, similar to Men again. It didn't quite cohere the weirdness enough for me. It just sort of stopped. But I did like the animation style a lot. The sort of line drawn in fact vaguely comic booky style here. Works very much for me. I was very much enjoying it while I was watching it, but I didn't feel like the story quite came together enough at the end for me. But there was some strong, confident wankiness here. Fair enough.
And yeah, again, very beautiful, bright sort of colour design, like a real kind of showcase for animation talent.
Yeah, no, it's good. Not my number one, or indeed in my top three, but I can respect it. Again, this is a good collection. There aren't really many full-on bad ones.
Yeah.
In fact, just to use the full cow of my notes document, the only two we haven't mentioned are the Three Robots sequel, which was alright. It was watchable if slightly forgettable, I think.
Yeah.
It had a slightly... I don't know. A style of humour I found slightly annoying.
Yeah.
Bit smug, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, and I didn't feel the need for them to do a sequel to one from the first volume. I felt that, like, it was just sort of retreading the same ground with bringing back these characters who weren't exactly, like, electric characters to begin with. It wasn't bad, just, yeah, a bit forgettable.
And Bad Travelling, the second one. I think the only other one we haven't mentioned. To be fair, it's actually also quite good. It's got a very nice sort of animation style for the sort of horrible, scummy, trapped at sea, everything's going wrong, it's dark, it's cold, it's miserable, everything's damp. And it does communicate that very well. It's very nicely animated. It's very standard and tropey in a lot of ways, but it does do them very well.
Yeah, I think if we'd stretched to a top 5, this might have squeezed in a number 5. I did like it. Again, it's very much a sort of fantasy horror story you'd get from a short story collection. You know, some people at sea, they meet a big nasty sea monster. They try to make a deal with it. That obviously backfires. You know, but it's got some good horror bits in it. There's a lot of scary bits. Again, like well animated, things like that. Yeah, there's sort of Lovecraftian sea monstery vibes. And yeah, quite a lot of tension. So yeah, I mean, it's just a good all-round sort of story.
Yeah, I kept waiting for the horror ending where it's revealed that the monster has escaped or one of the little baby monsters has escaped or something, but it never came.
No, it just sort of wraps it up quite neatly, but not too bad at all.
There we go. Despite all your dire warnings, our top three's actually overlapped.
Yeah, this time we coalesced, yeah.
So there you go. If you want the official, recommended by the whole team, Love, Death and Robots shorts, then I guess it's the Night of the Mini-Dead, Masons of Rats and Jibara.
Yeah, that's our favourites from Season 3.
Do it.
That's all we have time for today. If you have enjoyed this episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, then please subscribe in your podcatcher of choice and leave us a nice review to help other people find out about the show. You can also visit our website, moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can find back issues of the podcast, bonus audio content from Nick and myself.
And if you enjoy the show so much that you want to have random updates from us fired into your timeline, then why not follow us on Twitter as @MFV Podcasts or on Facebook as Moderate Fantasy Violence. Or if you want to go one step further, you can follow me personally on Twitter as @NickMB or Facebook @NickRyanWrites, or you can find out about my comics, including the latest one, Death of a Necromancer, which is slowly coming out one issue at a time, at nickbryan.com.
If you want more from me, you can follow me on Twitter, where I'm @AlistairJRBall, or you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com. Join us next time on the podcast, when we'll be satirising comebacks in Chippendale Rescue Rangers, and then trying to survive in a post-apocalyptic world in Step by Bloody Step, a new comic by Cy Spurrier and Matthias Berger. Join us in 2 weeks' time for all of that. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.